Hello, everybody, and welcome to Charts with Dan. Today, we're going to talk about the weekend box office, what little there is of it. But what I really want to cover are a couple of things that happened in the past week, things that could have massive ramifications on the theatrical exhibition business. Breaking down a little bit of that because it's kind of technical, but some things that are very interesting going forward as we look at recovery and what the future of movie theaters are going to be. But first, very briefly, just wanted to cover the weekend box office, and what is now being reported as number one is the latest film from David Ayer, which is called The Tax Collector, starring Shia LaBeouf. Very interesting. It's 4 years, believe it or not, to the weekend that Suicide Squad made its debut, and now David Ayer reportedly back on top, jockeying for position with a re-release of The Empire Strikes Back for the number one spot at the weekend box office. Shia LaBeouf really committed to his role. If you do a little bit of research, he got a full chest tattoo, like an actual tattoo, for his role in this film. So we have The Tax Collector at number one at the box office, where movies are being shown right now. We're also going to see that movie when we look at the VOD charts for this weekend. So David Ayer and Shia LaBeouf at the top of the domestic box office. But what I really want to cover is two major events that happened just in the last 7 days since our last charts episode. The first one being the other shoe finally dropping on Mulan. Disney had pulled it off of its release schedule indefinitely. Last week, the company announced that Mulan will debut exclusively on Disney Plus as a streaming film. There was much talk about what's going to happen with Mulan. Now, a couple of caveats to this. It will only be available exclusively on Disney Plus where Disney Plus is available. So, in other words, there's no hybrid release in areas where Disney Plus is available to consumers. There will be no theatrical exhibition in those territories. However, for places where there is no Disney Plus, including China, Mulan will be getting a theatrical release. So it is a hybrid release in a way, in the sense that Disney wants consumers in as many places as possible to have access to the film, but for people that already have Disney Plus, they want to make sure that Mulan is available to them exclusively on Disney Plus. Now, one thing that was cleared up and that I had questions about when this was first announced is that the $29.99 fee, and that seems a little hefty for Mulan, is not a rental fee like a lot of the PVOD rentals have been lately. For example, Trolls World Tour, where you pay $20 to rent the movie and you have it for a 48-hour window. The $29.99 fee for Mulan lets you keep access to that movie for as long as you are a subscriber to Disney Plus. So, as long as you keep paying for the Disney Plus service, if you pay that $30 fee for Mulan, then you will get to keep the movie and watch the movie whenever you wish. So it's a bit of a hybrid of a rental, but you don't quite own it, because if you discontinue that Disney Plus membership, then you no longer have access to the film. Obviously, for theater owners, this is a bit of a blow because, along with Tenet and maybe the New Mutants, we'll get to that later on in the show, but Wonder Woman 1984, potentially later in the fall, Mulan was one of those titles that they were hoping would get people back in theaters when and if they open. As of right now, many theaters are slated to start opening next week in some parts of the country. So, very possible that theaters will be open when Mulan is released on VOD. The date they set for that, by the way, is September 4th, which is also interesting because that means it'll be going head-to-head with Tenet, which will be opening in select U.S. cities, but not available on streaming. So we have kind of a theater versus streaming clash of the titans right now for the Labor Day weekend frame. So let's look at what that does to the exhibition schedule. This thing is starting to look like a coloring book. So Mulan goes from moved indefinitely to on Disney Plus on September 4th. Now, there were a couple of other changes in the scheduling. Antebellum, which was at one time on the schedule for August 21st, has been gone from moved indefinitely to it will now be a VOD only release on September 18th. And then Bill and Ted Face the Music, which had moved to a hybrid VOD theatrical release on September 1st, has decided to move out of the way of both Mulan and Tenet. That they have moved their VOD/limited theatrical release to August 28th. So they moved up a week. This is a very interesting topic, as I mentioned, particularly for theater owners. Now, Bob Chapek, the head of the Walt Disney Company, has said this is a one-off. So for everybody that said, oh, is Black Widow going to do this, etc., the company line right now is that this is a one-time only thing, that the theater or that the studio wanted to release Mulan. They wanted to get it out to consumers, and this was the way they thought that they could most effectively do it at this time. They say that they have no future plans to make this a model for other big Disney releases. However, there's always the big question that if they see a lot of traction with this, and if they get great theatrical success with this, theatrical, I guess, in the VOD platform, will they want to do this? Because keep in mind, whereas a studio has to split revenue with traditional theatrical exhibition, they get some of the money, the theaters get some of the money, although Disney has some very advantageous deals with a lot of exhibitors, which we're going to talk about in a second as we talk about the other big story this week. They don't have to split that $29.99 VOD fee or whatever you want to call it with Disney Plus with anybody but themselves. The other side being that they have a reported $200 million budget to recoup with Mulan. So is this going to make financial sense? I honestly don't know. We are in uncharted, no pun intended, territory here. But you have to think that if Disney does see a good deal of financial success with this, particularly with the unpredictability of the theatrical market, that this could be a model that they use going forward. However, as of today, no plans for this to affect future Disney releases, particularly Black Widow, Soul from Pixar, both still on the schedule for later this year. But a very interesting situation here with Mulan and the future of exhibition. So that's a move that takes tens of millions of potential dollars out of the theatrical exhibition market. And then there was some legal maneuvering, somewhat unrelated to the pandemic, but also could tie into consequences of the pandemic, that is actually an overturning of a landmark Supreme Court decision from the 1940s that could really reshape how movies are distributed in the future. And you may have seen or read about this, but earlier, I believe last year, the U.S. Department of Justice asked for a review of what are called the Paramount Decrees. Now, what are the Paramount Decrees? Let's break that down for just a second because it covers a lot of ground, but kind of the bullet points on it. Back in 1948, there was a landmark Supreme Court ruling, United States versus Paramount Pictures. This was after almost a decade of legal fights regarding this issue. Basically, it was an antitrust case when it came down to it because many studios at that time also owned theater chain. So they controlled, it's called vertical integration, both the production and the distribution of motion pictures, as well as a lot of other practices that the legal system was asked to review. Now, this ruling applied to the Big Five at that time. The Big Five studios, that would be Paramount, RKO, which no longer exists, later largely became Disney, MGM, Fox, and Warner Brothers. One of the things that it did was it outlawed something called block booking. Now, block booking is something that we're going to go into in detail in a few minutes, but it's basically would force theaters to book several movies from one studio in order to get one movie. So you couldn't just book the movie that you wanted. You'd have to book 6 or 7 of the movies that you wanted. It was a way for studios to force theaters to show more of their films. It also, as I mentioned, forced studios to divest themselves of theaters that they owned. Many people credit this ruling for an expansion in independent theaters and screens in the decades after, because keep in mind, this was a different time. This was a time when most cities had 1 or 2 theaters, and each of those theaters had 1 or 2 screens. This is not the multiplex kind of environment that we live in now. So if a studio owned a theater, then that theater largely would only play movies from that studio. Well, what would that do? It would restrict access to movies from other studios because you have to wait in line for a screen, especially if there's only 1 or 2 in every town. So the argument was that this really, number one, led to the decline of the studio system, wherein they largely held all the power top to bottom in the movie industry, and that it opened the door for theaters to choose to play independent films and for theaters that were not backed by studios to be able to exist. So why were these things overturned? Well, one of the things that was cited in the decision in the court that ruled that the Paramount decrees should be set aside is that it didn't apply to a lot of the current people that are in the business. And that is true. Technically, the legal ruling only applied to the studios at that time. Studios like Disney, who at the time did not own a exhibition arm, were not covered by the Paramount Decrees. Amazon, Netflix, Apple, all these companies that came after that are now making movies and making stuff for their streaming services and perhaps wanting to show them in theaters, were not technically covered by these decrees, although a lot of people, basically because this was established law, the argument from people who were fighting to keep these decrees in place said, well, yes, it doesn't technically cover them, but it was established law. So many companies who weren't covered by this essentially said, well, we can't do these things because we have legal precedent that says they're illegal. So obviously, if we try them, saying that we're not covered by it, then if it goes to court, they'll cite legal precedent saying, well, this has been found to be illegal. And so it was for many people kind of an unwritten thing that if you try these things, if you try as an exhibitor to buy a theater chain, that it's going to be found illegal. That will now not be the case. Now, there is a 2-year sunset period on some of the provisions, including block booking. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to go into that in a second. So these things don't go away immediately. But let's get into kind of what both sides are saying about this. People that are saying that you shouldn't revoke these things, as I mentioned, they're saying it opens the door for studios to buy theaters and restrict access to movies, like was happening way back in the golden era of Hollywood, and largely at the expense of movie theaters and films. People that say that you should revoke these decrees, and this includes the Department of Justice and the court that ruled that these decrees should go away. They say that they're antiquated regulations. Studio systems are not likely to be able to manufacture that kind of industry again, that it didn't cover a whole lot of major players. There are a lot of arguments for and against this. The big one being, studios owning theaters. A lot of people are saying like, well, would they even want to do that? And that's a great question at this point, because in case you haven't noticed, a movie theater, a brick and mortar movie theater, not exactly a great investment right now. Wouldn't put my money into that. Plus, a lot of these networks, if you look at Warner Media and Disney, even Apple and Amazon, they're putting all of their money into streaming. They're going kind of the opposite of movie theaters. So I think there's some credence to the argument that right now it doesn't really look like a lot of studios would even be interested in buying a theater chain, because it's a really bad investment and they're moving everything away from that. But in theory, this could open up the doors for, let's say, Universal. Let's say they struck this deal with AMC and they want to go even further. Let's say Universal buys AMC. Well, then Universal can program AMC however they want to program AMC. They could give preferential treatment to their own movies if they so desired. Or let's say Universal really wants to move their business away from the brick and mortar theater business. Well, you could buy AMC, and then under the guise or in the interest of streamlining the business, you could close half their locations and then severely restrict the number of theaters that there are in the United States and elsewhere, which would then push consumers toward streaming and watching at home if that's the way you want to push your business. So there are a lot of hypotheticals and what-ifs that aren't great for the theatrical exhibition business, but there are also a lot of questions about whether any studio would want to buy a theater chain at this point in time. But the thing that I really want to get into that raises some interesting questions, and I think some really troubling questions for the future, is this concept of something called block booking. Now, as I mentioned, block booking is when a studio goes to a theater chain and says, oh, do you want one of our movies? Well, you have to block these other 6 or 7 movies. Now, as I mentioned, there's a 2-year sunset period, so this won't happen right away. But I wanted to take this year, for example, and show you what could potentially happen under a block booking system if it becomes legal, if and when it becomes legal in 2 years. Right now, let's say a studio wants to play Black Widow. Well, they book Black Widow. They work with Disney. They book the film to play in their theaters. And by the way, there have already been a lot of complaints from theater owners about Disney that the terms under which they have to operate, a guaranteed window of having to show these films, the percentage of the money that goes to Disney versus the theaters itself. There are already a lot of complaints that these terms are aggressive at best and really unfair to theater owners, because Disney is big and they know that theaters really, to stay afloat, kind of have to book a lot of their movies because they are the biggest movies going. So even under the current system, a lot of people have said that Disney is already demanding too much when it comes to booking movies. But let's look at how 2020 might work under a block booking system. So once again, let's say a theater wants to play Black Widow. Well, Disney could say, okay, that's great. You can have Black Widow. But, we also own Pixar. So if you want to play Black Widow, then we're going to need you to go ahead and guarantee that you're also going to book and play Pixar's Soul, which comes out later this year, for a certain window of time. Again, a movie theater is going to be heavily invested in getting Black Widow because that's the latest MCU film. Particularly, let's say this pandemic had never happened. Obviously, the movie that kicks off the summer, you're going to want that. Well, Disney could also say like, oh yeah, we own Pixar. We also own 20th Century Studios now. So if you want Black Widow, we need you to play Soul. And we're also going to need you to book New Mutants and Free Guy and The King's Man and Death on the Nile for this year as well. So, Black Widow, it comes with these 5 other films as well. But you know what? We also own Fox Searchlight, and we have some real prestige films that we want to get out in front of people later this year. So you know what? We're also going to need you to book Antlers and The French Dispatch and The Personal History of David Copperfield. So here you have one studio, and this is the latest. This is the way that studios are doing business now. One studio that owns many different arms of distribution. This theater chain now, to play one movie, now has to book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 films in order to play one movie. Now, if you're AMC or you're Regal, maybe that's not so onerous. Maybe you can do that because you're a multiplex. You have a lot of screens. You want Black Widow. You'd probably be playing those movies anyway. Whatever, you'll do it. Here's where I think it gets really scary for independent theater owners. Let's say you're an independent theater owner. There's a great theater here in Los Angeles called the Vista that has 1 screen or 2 or 3 screens. Now you have Disney coming to you and saying, hey, if you want Black Widow, the movie that's kicking off the summer, probably one of the movies that you're counting on to keep your theater afloat this year because you're going to bring in a lot of the crowds, you have to book these 8 other movies. And those 8 other movies could book up your 1 screen for months out of the year. It's possible, depending on which ones they ask you to book, that if Disney goes to a single screen theater and demands that they have to block book their releases to get one big movie, that could book up that entire theater schedule for an entire year. So they have to choose between passing on one movie, which could be a huge boost to their box office, or booking their entire theater for a year with one studio's movies. And if 2 or 3 of those movies don't hit, then that hits that theater extra hard. These are the things that I really hate about these Paramount decrees being ruled as unnecessary, because I can see this happening. Of course, studios, especially in an era where there's so many more movies and so many more streaming shows and streaming movies and you name it competing for attention, do you not think that studios are going to use every advantage they have at their disposal to make sure that their movies are seen? Of course, a lot of these studios are going to block book their films because they want to guarantee the screens. And if they can tie a smaller movie, as I mentioned, Disney owns any number of different arms that make so many different kinds of films. If you could guarantee that one of your smaller films that you really want to do well could play on the same number of screens as one of your bigger blockbuster films, of course you're going to do that. It's a business. You want that to happen, and there's a reason why this was made illegal. It's because it was unfair to some other movies, because something like A24 or Neon or one of these smaller distributors, they don't have that same kind of power and leverage, and they're going to eventually find themselves getting edged out of screens because other studios have these block booked sections of theaters locked up for perhaps months. So I don't like this. Strangely, at first it was the theater ownership that bothered me the most, but I understand the economics behind saying that, number one, I don't know if any studios are really going to invest in a movie theater chain. Number two, yes, it didn't really cover a lot of theater chains, even if it was considered perhaps a guiding principle of law, but there's a lot of steps that you have to go through. The thing that I really don't like is the idea that you're now going to make it legal again in 2 years' time, if this is allowed to pass and the sunset period ends, for studios to block book their films and potentially squeeze out their competition. That's what antitrust is, and they say that there are existing antitrust laws that would prohibit things like the abuse of this, but you know what? This was an existing antitrust law, and now it's gone. So I think that there's some very, very, very troubling ramifications from the revocation of these decrees. But we don't really know what those are going to be until 2 years from now, potentially. So this is a story to keep your eye on. Obviously, it's a bit of a sleeper story because we don't know exactly what the full picture of this is going to be for a while now. But this is why when people say things like these legal cases, we used to call them movie broccoli when I was at Screen Junkies, this is why they're important, because they can have vast and far-reaching ramifications on how the theatrical exhibition business works. By the way, we don't even know what the theatrical exhibition business is going to look like in 2 years. There may already be far fewer theaters and far fewer screens available than there are right now, depending on how much longer these closures last. So this is one of the, again, I feel like there's so many weeks that I say this is one of the more interesting stories that has come up in a while, but this really is. We are in a huge period of change when it comes to how the movie business is done. And this is another step in that change that could drastically affect the average movie-going experience. So let's move on from that to some of the other mainstays of the show. The first being our flashback to a time when people were able to go to the movies and ones that weren't block booked. Let's go back to the early 90s to 1993 and one of the best late summer action films of all time, and that is Harrison Ford in The Fugitive. That opened in 1993, some 27 years ago, hard to believe, at number one with $23.7 million. Impressive today, more impressive by 1993 numbers. Look at that number two, though. Connery Snipes. What a combination. As a matter of fact, you had three kind of older male action stars right there at 1, 2, 3. Rising Sun at number 2. Then Clint Eastwood in The Line of Fire at number 3. If you haven't seen that, that's another great early 90s action movie. John Malkovich, great villain. Rene Russo, also great in that movie. Then at number 4, a big movie for 90s kids like me, Free Willy. And another big movie for 90s kids like me, Jurassic Park, which of course had come out weeks earlier, still in the top 5. But a very 90s top 5 there 27 years ago this weekend at the box office. Some other notable moments to look at for this weekend in box office history. We had James Cameron, one of his rare box office disappointments, The Abyss in 1989, opened in second place. He was coming off of Terminator and Aliens, but yeah, The Abyss, not quite a huge hit, or at least not probably one he would have wanted. Back in 1992, Unforgiven, a Best Picture winner, and Three Ninjas, a Best Picture winner for a lot of kids of that era, opened at number 1 and number 4. Unforgiven would go on to win Best Picture almost 6 months later at the Academy Awards. Then in 1999, a key weekend. First of all, The Sixth Sense began, and a truly impressive run on its way to a Best Picture nomination, as well as Mystery Men and The Iron Giant. All three of those movies opened on the same weekend back in 1999. And then in 2015, 5 years ago, hard to believe, everybody remember Fant4stick? Or Fantastic Four. That was a box office disaster. That opened way lower than expected 5 years ago this weekend. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, 4 years ago, we had the opening of Suicide Squad by David Ayer. So time flies when you're having fun. And I think at this point I would almost go see Fant4stick in a theater again, just to get back into a movie theater safe and sound. Why don't we look at what people are watching at home while they can't go largely to a movie theater? And let's start with the top 10 over on Amazon. The Secret Garden, a new version of The Secret Garden, there at number 1. Then you have Trolls World Tour and Red 2, two holdovers from last week. The Tax Collector, as I mentioned, from David Ayer at number 4. Then The Outpost, The Gentleman, Game Night, and Jumanji The Next Level, which were on the chart last week. Sonic the Hedgehog back on the chart there at number 9. And then John Wick Chapter 3, which continues to be a big choice for people watching at home on Amazon, rounding out the top 10. Now let's head over to iTunes and see what people are watching on their Apple devices. We have The Tax Collector, the number 1 film rental on iTunes over the past week. Then Made in Italy, another new film at number 2. Capone, Josh Trank. We were just talking about Fant4stick. Josh Trank's latest, Capone, comes back onto the chart there at number 3, followed by The Outpost, Waiting for the Barbarians, Trolls World Tour, The Lost Husband, The Secret Dare to Dream, The Rental, and Jumanji Jumanji: The Next Level coming back into the top 10. Both Jumanji films have been very popular with families over this past summer, these past few months as people are watching at home. And let's see what people are watching over on Netflix. At number 1, we have Work It, which is a new Netflix original. Then Dennis the Menace. Speaking of 90s kids, the 90s movies, Dennis the Menace, followed by Jurassic Park. Mr. Deeds. Adam Sandler's having a really great summer here on Netflix. It seems like there's a Sandler movie in the top 5 every single week. It's almost like Netflix has a huge wide-ranging deal with him, is invested in his movies doing well. Then we have National Security at number 5. Acts of Violence, late career Bruce Willis. Then we have Malibu Rescue, The Next Wave, a new movie at number 7. Latte and the Magic Waterstone, the German animation film that we talked about last week at number 8. The Kissing Booth 2 at number 9. And then the sequel to Jurassic Park, The Lost World Jurassic Park, there at number 10. And before we close the show, of course, we have to get to our 2 countdowns, and we are getting critically close to the ending of both of our countdowns. We may be within striking distance of the end of one of them. Let's see where we stand. First of all, there is the countdown to new movies. We're 11 days from Unhinged. Unhinged has not moved from the production schedule. No theater chain here in the United States has said that they are pausing their reopening plans, although when and where and how they can reopen is still very much up in the air. For example, as I sit here in Los Angeles, there are currently no plans to reopen any indoor movie theaters, nor has there been clearance given to do so. Perhaps that'll come in the next week. We don't know. But Unhinged still is slated to hit theaters in the next 11 days, next Friday. I am hoping to bring you a review of that film. I think I'm going to be able to get a screener link from the studio on that, so if you do have theaters that are opening and playing Unhinged, I'm hoping to bring a review of that film to you next week. And then we have the ever-present countdown to New Mutants. This has been going on for a very long time across this show and my old show over on Screen Junkies. We are at 18 days. We are at critical mass here. I don't know if we have ever gotten this close. I'd have to go back and check. I don't know if we've ever gotten this close to the actual theoretical release of the New Mutants. Unless we hear differently, all systems are go for the release of the New Mutants in a little under 3 weeks' time. Will it actually happen? Will the New Mutants become more than a theoretical possibility? Will it become a reality? We have been waiting for years, literally years, to find out the answer to this question. We may only have less than 3 weeks to go, but we're just going to have to wait and see. That's all I got for you this week. I'm glad you were here to talk legalese and everything else, and actually very little box office and very few charts on this show. But hey, what else is new? We're doing what we can here. Thank you so much for watching me here, and join me next time. I'll be here next Monday with the latest in charts and whatever else is happening in the world of movies. And later this week, I have a review of the newest Netflix original film starring Jamie Foxx and Joseph Gordon-Levitt called Project Power. Look for that on Thursday evening here, Pacific time, when the embargo drops. I'm excited to bring that to you. Until next time, thanks for watching.